Mesdames et messieurs, bonjour, good morning everybody. It is my great pleasure to be here to introduce this symposium called Feeding the World Population Sustainably, a path from impactful development to empowerment without jeopardizing environmental health. My name is Catherine Mercier. I'm a journalist at CBC. I'm the host of La Semaine Verte, an agriculture show on the French network of CBC. I'm a proud McGill alumni. I graduated in 2000 with a BA in modern languages, German studies, and Russian studies, and I've since moved on to work in journalism. I was also previously a correspondent for CBC and Radio-Canada in New York, and also Asia Bureau Chief in Beijing. But enough about me, it's all about you today. I want to salute our dignitaries, the Mayor of Pointe-Claire, Monsieur Timothy Thomas, bonjour. And also, joining us from Rome, I believe she is with us, Dr. Ismahan El-Wafi, the FAO Chief Scientist. Maybe she's not with us right now, but she'll be with us shortly. So, what awaits us this morning? Why are we here this morning for this symposium? Let me explain to you a little bit the context and the structure. This symposium is part of McGill's 200th anniversary celebrations, and one of the driving questions of this symposium is, given the challenges posed by climate change and the growing world population, how can we feed the world more sustainably? In other words, we all need to eat, but how can we do it without destroying the planet? And this symposium has been accepted as a side event leading up to the FAO's Science and Innovation Forum, which will take place in Rome from October 17th to the 21st. And also, I'd like to mention it's one of the last major events of the Bicentennial celebrations before the closing concert on October 23rd. I'd like to introduce the opening remarks by Professor Christopher Manfredi. He's the interim principal and vice chancellor at McGill University. He also has served as provost and vice principal at McGill since 2015, and he was reappointed for a second 5-year term in 2019. Unfortunately, Professor Manfredi is away, so his remarks are on video, and they will be followed by Professor Salwa Karboun. Bonjour, Madame Karboun. She is Associate Dean of Research at the Faculty of Agriculture and Environmental Science here at McGill. She will present the faculty's strategic research priorities. We're very glad to have you with us this morning. Her main research expertise is in the design and development of new green technologies and approaches to improve the quality and the functionality and also the shelf life of the food that we eat. And for my show, La Semaine Verte, we had the great pleasure of interviewing Dr. Karboun a few years ago. Her lab is right across the hall if you want to sneak a peek before you leave. It's really beautiful, and it's interesting to see how you can work with these molecules that have been in the plants that we have around us for years and years and years, of course, but we don't know them so well, and Professor Karboun and her team is helping us discover the many functionalities of plants that we know, but not that much, actually. So first the video, and then the floor will be yours, Professor Karboun.
Bonjour et bienvenue à tous ceux et celles qui se joignent à nous virtuellement et en personne pour ce symposium. We're delighted to offer this conference as a side event of the UN's FAO Science and Innovation Forum and as part of the closing program for McGill's bicentennial anniversary. The future of food is a topic of critical importance that spans many disciplines. It was therefore only fitting that we opened our bicentennial with a conference on food security and that we now close with the topic of sustainable food and agriculture. Over the past 18 months, McGill has celebrated the 200 years of impact that our community has had, both at home and around the world. In marking this milestone, we have also been called upon to imagine what our next century will look like. What role will McGill play in addressing our world's grand challenges? How can we harness our strengths in research and education to shape the future for the better? Today, our society is facing challenges of tremendous complexity. Many of these challenges converge in the field of agriculture, environment, and nutrition, where the issues surrounding climate change, sustainability, supply chains, and population growth, to name a few, are acutely felt. As we embark on our third century, I have no doubt that McGill will continue to be at the forefront of addressing these challenges. We have a unique role to play. Research and education are the motors of innovation, and they will continue to be essential as we develop ways of feeding the world sustainably. Just as important are events such as this one, which unite different stakeholders in the name of knowledge exchange and collaboration. Je vous souhaite à tous une excellente conférence et des discussions fructueuses. Merci.
Okay, bonjour tout le monde. Good afternoon, good morning for those that are joining us online. So it's really for me a great pleasure to join you today and to speak in this side event of FAO, of Science and Innovation Forum. So just for me to move the slide. So feeding the world population sustainably. So this is one of our focus, this is one of our challenges, and we know that guiding and changing the future of our society, of our social and ecological environmental system does require a lot of efforts, and does also require an extraordinary path. And I think science, we all know, can make things happen. So I would like just to give some perspective about the Canadian agriculture, considering that many of our partners worldwide are joining us today. So in 2017, the Federal Government Advisory Council came up with a document that it's known as a Barton document, and in which they have highlighted the importance of the Canadian agriculture. So the Canadian agriculture has been challenged to grow the national economy with other 6 areas, and they have even set a target to achieve, which is trying to increase the export by 75 billion in agri-food products. So this tells us how important the Canadian agriculture, and also it tells us how much we need to do to be able to achieve this target. Now, it has been mentioned by our Provo that we know that there are many global, local, and national challenges that are facing our environments, facing our natural ecosystem, agriculture, and food system. And all those challenges, they do call for major transformation, and they need a multidisciplinary area. So just to name some, so we have the population growth, but not only the population growth, we have been witnessing changes in dietary habits. We have been witnessing changes in the income distribution as well. There are other related to the climate change. We have been looking a lot to understand the impact of the climate change, looking on how can we mitigate this climate change, the state of our current natural resources. Can we predict how these states will change? And this is an important endeavor that we are working on it at our faculty, because if we are able to predict, we can come up with action that will help us to guide us. And of course, the pandemic and conflicts and all that add to our global challenges. So what we are doing at MAC, so MAC at faculty, from where I'm speaking today, is the Faculty of Agriculture and Environmental Science. We consider ourselves as a hub of research and innovation of sustainable system, and we cover the complete continuum of the agriculture and environment, going from water, landscape, plant, animal, food, and nutrition. So research innovation is at the center of our activities, as our principal mentioned, but also we train our future leader and thinker as well, and the outreach as well, it takes an important part of our faculty. So in terms of pillar, so we envision and we work toward achieving an academic excellence where we want not only to contribute locally and nationally, but also to contribute globally. We're looking as well, how can we strengthen the global scientific community in a way that can help us to advance the thinking and advance the technology, and of course to address some of the global challenges that I just mentioned. So our strategic research priorities are centered and around 6 important themes. We talk about environment, ecology, and sustainability, the importance of water and soil and their integrated management, how can we produce sustainably, how can we produce crop, livestock production, and also how can we secure that we can supply safe and nutritious and secure food across the globe. And also the nutrition, we're lucky to have the School of Nutrition as well in our faculty, and that help us to link the food, nutrition, and health as well. And we have the bioeconomy that can play an important role. So I'm just going to go very quickly through some of those research areas to highlight, to give some highlights. So just to let you know that this is all the team that we're working on them, they are quite interdisciplinary team, and that considering the type and considering the field where we are. So we need discipline, we need people all working together to be able to tackle that. So if we look at the sustainable crop and livestock production, we're looking to develop emerging tools that will help us to ensure a sustainable production, but more importantly, how to convert those conventional area with the emerging areas. From water and soil, we know how conservation, sustainable management of the soil are extremely important. So it's trying to understand the impact of all the global changes in the soil and the water, but also to try to see how we can come up with the best management system. And we are also working on supporting the production of safe, nutritious, and healthy food supply, and through that, trying to understand the food system and trying to see how we can address the emerging and traditional challenges and improve the food functionalities. So from environmental and ecology and sustainability perspective, the linkage between health and human and the environment is so important and is so complex as well. So we have colleagues that they're working at looking how the global changes are impacting the ecosystem, but more importantly, if they can develop any ecosystem services that can help us manage the global environment ecology in a sustainable path. So I won't go in detail, but we have few scientific questions that guide us and that in our endeavor for any research that we are doing. And you will see that most through the discussion that we will have in the round table, that most of those questions are quite global questions. And they are questions that we're looking at them to have an impact not only at the national, but also at the global level. So just to give you some research examples. So technology, we know how technology is important. And the importance of the technology, it goes through developing sensor system, developing soil, plants, and animals. So, and we have colleagues working on how can we adapt this technology. We're also looking to the management practices, like an example. So looking to the sustainable agriculture practices. And how can we promote a climate-smart agriculture? So this is go through the integration of crop livestock and sustainable livestock production, but does also go through developing a climate-resilient variety. And we are going to have my colleague who is going to cover that in the roundtable. So the converging some of non-conventional science together, that's something that also interests us. Like in this particular example, we are converting animal behavior and welfare sciences. And at the end, we need to be able to translate that. So looking how we can translate all this technology in a way that the farmer can adapt them. So this is what we are doing through some research, trying to examine how farmer can make a risky decision and how we can help them to adapt these technologies. So going through the post-harvest, we're looking how to reduce it, also how to preserve the food significantly. And as Catherine has mentioned, the functionality of the food, the smart food. So that's looking on how we can, from using the high-tech technology, how can we enhance the food functionality and ensure the nutrient efficiency as well. So linking food and nutrition and health has been also important, and we will discuss that more in detail. And also we look at how can we enhance the efficiency of nutrition-sensitive programming as well. So my colleague here will talk about this program where we're trying to see how we can evaluate any nutrition-sensitive programming. So I'm just trying to give some highlights of what we are doing, but of course, if you have any question, we will distribute the slide and I can connect you with the appropriate PI for doing that. So action to achieve sustainability has been also been a tackle, and we have an insect resonate that help us to understand the relationship between people and nature and how to promote the sustainable and resilient working landscape and ecosystems. So it's really a pleasure for me to be here and to give a big highlight of what we are doing. I'm looking forward to the roundtable discussions. And we have a Vox videos that they are going to take place now.
I think that in the future, we will have some shortages maybe, especially that nowadays, you know, everything that's happening in Ukraine had a direct impact on everything that we were importing from them.
I think we need to start being like sustainable as well about the way we grow food, because I know that like a big like environmental problem is that a lot of like the space that we use for agriculture is for like to feed like cattle, and so that's a big problem.
And making sure that our food resources are spread out and are available to other people and everybody, and that we don't have absurd inflations in food prices, so that everybody would have access to and also resources in order to get them food that would come from a sustainable place. So I definitely think it's something that we can manage if we put our minds and our money towards it.
I don't know, because our population is growing, and even though we're using different ways of like multiplying or accelerating the amount of food that we can get, there's only a certain limit that we can do that of eventually, because our population is not just growing, it's also acceleratingly growing as well, right? So we don't know. I don't know what it's going to be like in the next 50 years, even with this whole global warming happening, which also compromises food security, but also food sources. But if I were to give you a yes or no, ultimately, yes, I'll be optimistic and say yes. I think because we're aware of it now, for at least 50 years or so before it's projected to go completely 180, basically. I think we have a good grasp of what's going on, yeah.
The alternative, I like sci-fi books, so maybe we are going to maybe try some pills. We are already using pills for all those people going to the space, NASA, and maybe it's going to be maybe more affordable for everyone.
Probablement par des programmes d'aide et des programmes genre d'agriculture locale, ça pourrait fonctionner, genre aider le monde à produire leur propre bouffe ou genre être autosuffisant, peut-être ça pourrait fonctionner.
It's now time for the first roundtable of the day, and it is entitled Eco-Innovation, Extending the Scope of Sustainability to Drive Changes. And I'd like to welcome the moderator, Professor Mehran Dasmajhi, and speakers on the stage, please. So Professor Mehran Dasmajhi joined the Department of Plant Science as an assistant professor in the fall of 2020. His research group studies the biochemistry of crop and medicinal plants, focusing on pathways, producing health and defense compounds. That's right? please join us. We also have Dr. Ismahan El-Wafi, who is joining us from Rome. Bonjour, hello.
Hi, Jonathan.
Hello. Dr. Ismahan El-Wafi holds the position of Chief Scientist at the Food and Agriculture Organization, the FAO of the United Nations. It's a new position that was created within FAO's core leadership structure since September 2020. From 2012 until her appointment, Dr. El-Wafi was Director General at the International Center for Biosaline Agriculture based in the United Arab Emirates. Dr. El-Wafi had previously held senior scientific and leadership positions at Agriculture and Agri-Food Canada. And it's good to mention she's a strong advocate for diversifying, and that's going to be very interesting today, diversifying into neglected and underutilized crops and rethinking the food system as a whole. She's also internationally known for her work on promoting use of non-fresh water, also very important because that's a limited resource we have, the water on this earth, and empowerment of women in science. She holds a BSc in agricultural sciences and an MSc in genetics and plant breeding from the Hassan II Institute of Agronomy in Morocco. And she also has her PhD from the University of Cordoba in Spain. Welcome, Dr. El-Wafi.
Merci beaucoup, Catherine. Merci.
And now I'd like to welcome Dr. Valerio Hoyos Villegas. Please join us. Dr. Valerio Hoyos Villegas is the lead principal investigator of the Pulse Breeding and Genetics Laboratory at McGill, which is a variety release-driven program for the enhancement of Canadian and world supply of pulses as major staples. And last but not least, Professor Gordon Hickey. Please join us, Dr. Hickey. He's professor and William Dawson Scholar in the Department of Natural Resources Science at McGill University, specializing in sustainable natural resource management, policy, and governance. And he has been working on food security and social ecological resilience issues since 2010. The floor is now yours.
Thank you so much. So McGill's Bicentennial couldn't have come at a more critical juncture in human history, perhaps an inflection point, depending on how we proceed afterwards. The ever-present and growing risks and challenges coming from climate change, of course the COVID-19 pandemic, and growing conflicts around the world affecting everything. Pervasively throughout our lives. And of course here at McGill, and especially I would like to think at this campus, we have facts, science, really research-based solutions and also investigations going on every day on campus. As was mentioned, I joined in August 2020. And since then, I've really been struck by how remarkably multidisciplinary this campus is. I talk to folks involved in nanotechnologies, genomics. Myself, I work on synthetic biology and plant metabolism. But we also have within our silos some true experts in the field. So I'm happy to be here and perhaps be proposing some solutions to the challenges that we face. So today we're really grateful that Dr. Ismahan El-Wafi is joining us, a chief scientist at the UN FAO. And I will start with Dr. El-Wafi to tell us what she's advocating for day to day at the FAO. Dr. El-Wafi.
Thank you very much, Mehran, and really a pleasure to join this event in Canada, in Montreal, and particularly around the Bicentennial of McGill. Thank you very much, and I'm really happy that it turned out that we could really fit it in our Science and Innovation Forum. So maybe let me start by really, Metan, let me start by how proud I am that I have been at some time in my career have been through McGill, and I know very well the campus. I remember dearly the McDonald campus, but also all of McGill. So it's really nice to see a university that is doing so much for science. And that has in fact made so much impact, not only in agriculture, but in health, mathematics, you name it. So let me give to your question. So my role here in FAO is really to bring more science, technology, and innovation in the agriculture sector and the food sector. So FAO represents, it's a UN agency, it's a specialized UN agency on food and agriculture. And agriculture, the way we define it, it's very large. It's the plant production, it's the animal production, it's the fisheries and the aquaculture, it's the forestry, it's the climate change in the agri-food system, it's the biodiversification in the agri-food system. So it's very, very large. And we have been a technical agency for the last 76 years, looking at how could we bring science, technology, and innovation to solve the poverty and the hunger issues. So for us, SDG 2 is the most important. How could we get to zero hunger? And although we have been a technical agency of the UN, although we have been using always science and technology and innovation, I think we are not using it enough. We did not use it enough in the last 76 years. And that's where in the new structure of FAO and new strategic framework, the DG insisted, and that's a new vision of this group of management, that really we need to harness science, technology, and innovation more. And that's where the position of chief scientist was created and my office was created. So the way we want to do it is that we put our strategic framework around the thematic of really getting to SDG 2. How could we get to zero hunger? How could we reduce poverty, knowing that poverty is very much related to rural area and to agriculture? And how could we really reduce inequality? So we recognize in our strategic framework that the SDG 10, which is reducing inequality and inequalities, are really the basis and the beginning of the problem. So we need to address those inequalities. And I was very happy that Dr. Salwa Carbon mentioned it very clearly. So the way we want to do it, we say that we have to create 4 battles. To create those 4 battles, we need to transform our agri-food system. So we need to change or transform our agri-food system to become more efficient, to become more resilient, to become more sustainable and more inclusive. And with that, we get to the 4 better. Hopefully we'll get for better production, better nutrition, better environment, and a better life, leaving no one behind. And in my seat as a chief scientist, I'm looking at what science do we have and innovation to have a better production? How could we produce more with less, particularly in terms of quantity, but also quality? In nutrition, so what do we know really in the new era of science on nutrigenomics and what have you, to really have better nutrition? How could we make sure that our agri-food system, it's providing people with all the micronutrients and macronutrients that people are needing? And we should remember that we have still today 2 billion people of kids, particularly and children, that are malnourished. Then we have science for better environment. How could agriculture be a part of the solution? So yes, we are responsible for 30% of our greenhouse gas emission, but we are also sequestering a lot, not only through our forestry and our oceans and fisheries and what have you, but also through our soils, through our agriculture. So how could we really get better in terms of increasing our sequestration capacity? And it is possible. And then the 4th one, it's the better life, which is about income for farmers. How could we really redesign the agri-food system so the farmers have a better income and have dignity and a decent life? So that's in a nutshell what we do, bringing you in our strategic framework for the next 10 years and our strategy on science and innovation that was approved by our 194 member states just last June. And we are now finalizing the action plan to put it in place. Over to you, Mehran.
Thank you, Dr. Alwafi. It's really nice to hear what the FAO is doing in this field, and it's also nice to see in your bio that you worked at Agriculture and Agri-Food Canada at some point in your career. Myself as well, I was a master's and PhD student in a lab, but that was in Agriculture Canada, so it's nice to see the progression and how you're implementing change on a global scale now in your new role. So Fantastic. It's very nice.
Ramadan, and maybe we don't say it enough, but Canada is a wonderful miracle in terms of agriculture. So the prairies used to be a bare land 100 years ago, and see what they're producing today. And that was really through a huge investment in science, technology, and innovation, particularly through Agriculture, Agri-Food Canada, and of course the provinces as well, their own system. So it's really something to be celebrated. It's a success in the agriculture sector that was really based on proper planning and good investment in science, technology, and innovation, and of course, really providing the tools and the policies to let the private sector take the role that they need to do to get to the commercial production. And so we need to say it more and talk about it much louder.
Absolutely, and that's a great segue, because in my role as also a teacher, when I teach especially first-year students who are interested in the environment and wildlife, and maybe not directly on plants, during my course, they come across a lot of examples of how plants are truly at the center of a lot of our questions and issues surrounding the environment. And you don't necessarily have to be working out maybe in the fields or in a watershed or what have you to impact change in the environment. Plants are a really important part of that. And so I want to come to our next speaker, Dr. Hoyos Villegas, who has his master's in crop physiology from the University of Missouri-Columbia, a PhD from Michigan State University in plant breeding, genetics, and biotechnology, and has been with us since 2019, leading a pulse breeding and genetics group at McGill University. Valerio is also a leader in the National Association of Plant Breeders and a member of the Federal Plant Breeders' Rights Advisory Committee, and really leading both the science and some of the dialogue with policymakers on delivering new cultivars and delivering new technology domestically and internationally. And of course, his work on plant breeding, as Dr. El-Wafi also indicated, is one of the really booming sectors in Canada. You know, Canada is one of the large exporters of pulses globally. So I want to come to Dr. Hoyos Villegas to tell us a little bit about why plant breeding is important, and maybe why it's been sort of there's been a generational gap in our focus on plant breeding.
Thank you, Dr. Dasmachi. I'm very pleased to be here today. I'm also very pleased to hear that Dr. El-Wafi has a background in plant breeding, because every time I meet a plant breeder, I liken it to meeting almost a celebrity. Did you know that there are about 800 Major League Baseball players and only about 600 private and public breeders in North America? So you're more likely to meet a Major League Baseball player than to meet a plant breeder. So our education system really needs to address that gap, as Dr. Dasmachi mentions. So yes, my program very much focuses on ramping up the science and the technology needed in order to mitigate the risks that we face in terms of food production, but also in terms of the agroecosystem services that farms provide us all with, okay? And in particular, this comes from the idea that plant breeding, Canada and North America and many areas of the world have long histories of being involved in the activity of plant breeding. Us as humans, since the dawn of agriculture, we are inherent plant breeders. Knowingly, we have domesticated plants, and that, in a way, is whether it's purposefully or involuntarily, is an activity of selection and plant breeding. And so ever since then, we have been engaged in the adoption of technology and the adoption of making use of plants for the best possible applications for us as a society. But now we're shifting the focus more and more into understanding what it is that genetic resources are and what it is that they can contribute in terms of sustainability, productivity of farm cropping systems. So my lab, we have sort of an applied, we have very much an applied side as well as a fundamental side. On the applied side, we are very much a variety, as the bio mentioned, variety development-driven program where we work with multiple stakeholders, private, public, governmental stakeholders in North America to understand what are the needs across the value chain and address those needs via variety development. And then that adoption of technology, that's also part of the process that we undergo with the various stakeholders, particularly farmers. And we work in pulses because there is a real opportunity there, not just from a sustainability standpoint, but also from a climate change mitigation standpoint, as we understand more and more that our diets have big impacts into the have big impact on emissions. Consumers are asking more and more for plant-based products, plant-based protein, and there is a need for farmers to also be involved and participating in that whole conversion of the food chain. And so my lab addresses the needs of mainly of the primary production sector of pulses. And I know FAO has been quite active and quite driven in promoting pulses because they are also a major source of calories and macro and micronutrients in developing countries. And Canada is a major producer of many pulses, and this makes us directly involved in not just supplying these staple foods to our population here, but also in food insecure countries. And as we saw with the COVID-19 pandemic, these needs have been exacerbated by supply chain issues. So, as I said, I was recounting the story a little bit of plant breeding. And so we know now that with population growth, food supply is clearly not meeting the food demand, and we need to close this gap. But science, crop science has told us, we've learned from multi-environment studies that the experimental and theoretical yields of on-farm yields are not meeting the on-farm yields. So this we call this the yield gap, and the percentage at which we're closing that gap is one of the major ways that we can contribute to increasing the food supply. Okay, and so this is one of the areas where plant breeding is key because we fulfill a specific need in closing that gap as the seed sector, through the seed sector, because it is one of the most efficient ways of safeguarding and mitigating risk on farm. So one of the ways now, and from the scientific perspective that my lab works on is what are the ways that we can develop science and technology in order to address and mitigate that yield gap. And one of the ways is through understanding of the genetic architecture that controls the various traits that we're interested in. We also work in safeguarding, but as well leveraging genetic resources that are available for us to extract useful genetics that can be incorporated into elite materials that are useful for variety development purposes, but also to understand what are the interactions that happen at the population, from the population all the way to the genome level. And that leads me to the last point, which is integration of multiple layers of information, all the way from the genome to the phenome, so that we can best and most efficiently utilize the information in a plant breeding development sort of way.
Perfect, thank you. I'm lucky as well to kind of hopefully play a small, be a small cog in that role of going from the genome to the phenome with Dr. Hoyos Villegas as he looks at the genetic diversity of an important staple crop, common bean, which is a part of his project, and we might look at some of the chemical signals that come from that genetic diversity, leading to traits that are desirable, improving those traits. And this is not a short process, it's a long process. As I understand, a plant breeder might how many varieties, if you introduce into the commercial kind of carousel, would a plant breeder be happy with at the end of their tenure?
Well, it really depends on the crop that you work on. Some breeders, it might take, it really all depends on, particularly on the cycle time, right? So if you are, say, for example, a pine tree breeder, it might take 2 or 3 careers just to release one variety. In my case, I'm lucky enough that the cycle time for one generation of pulses is rather short. So, I would be very happy. Keep in mind that we work with multiple. When you deal with pulses, we're dealing with consumer-facing also characteristics, which we call market classes. So many of you are familiar with the various market classes that exist in beans, such as pinto beans, navy beans, black beans, etc. Each one of those is sort of a mini breeding program on their own. So if I am able to introduce one variety in the next of each one of those market classes in the next 10 years, I'm very happy. But I would say a very prolific breeder would introduce 40 to 50 in their careers. That's about 40 years.
Wow.
Yeah.
Amazing. And so I'm mindful today that we have some students in the audience as well. And when I was a graduate student, I was working on at a molecular level, looking at some of the compounds that are produced in soybean. But I was always interested in who are the people working at that interface between science and policy and good governance of these issues. So I think we might hear from Professor Gordon Hickey today about that interface a little bit. So Dr. Hickey is a professor and William Dawson Scholar in the Department of Natural Resource Sciences here, and he has specialized in sustainable natural resource management, policy, and governance, importantly. He is the founding head of the interdisciplinary Sustainable Futures Research Laboratory here and associate editor of important scientific journals, including Food Security and Society and Natural Resources. As was mentioned earlier, prior to joining McGill, he's worked in senior policy and management roles in government. So, Dr. Hickey, please.
Thank you. So, I look at things a little bit from taking a step back perspective. So we have been spending and working hard on scientific questions for a very long time. And the challenge of food security has been a major priority since the end of World War II and the establishment of the UN. And yet we see the changes and challenges continue and persisting. And in fact, it's not an issue of a lack of money. It's not really an issue of a lack of intelligence or effort. It's not even an issue of a lack of science in general. We have a lot of science. What it sometimes is an issue of just the complexity of the systems that we're seeking to intervene in, how we consider the complexity, how we embrace it, how we define the problems that we're trying to address, how we think about the kinds of people that would have to change and be involved if we want the kinds of changes we want to see to occur. I'm always reminded of this great image of someone like yourself standing on a podium saying, "Who wants change?" And everyone puts their hand up. And then the following question is, who wants to change? And not a hand goes up. And I think we can all think about that from our own perspectives as well. We do want to see change, but when we're asked to change, that's a different question. And so the societal and social aspects of science, how science interfaces with society is an area that I do research on, and in particular in the context of agriculture and agri-food systems, it's been on agricultural innovation systems and trying to bring a complex systems perspective to that. So we look at questions of how we organize across scales, across levels, from individual to global, how we design our science, how we think about questions of legitimacy, salience, credibility, which we know are essential attributes of any kind of science, or let's say applied science, or science conducted in the context of application. So those of us who do the kind of science that we do, we are only doing it really because we want to have an impact. We want to help with the problem. There's actually a problem that is a starting point for the questions that we're asking. And yet, the way we go about doing the science and producing the results and reporting them and then continuing the question and discussion unfortunately often hasn't led to the kinds of outcomes that we want. So this is a discussion and an ongoing discourse that's going on in our faculty. It's also going on within the field. How do we support and sustain innovation and creative innovation systems across scale? What are some of the different ways we need to think about things? To what extent are we addressing symptoms versus the root causes? How often are we working on an issue in agriculture that is actually driven by an issue in another sector? So we've got the intersectoral aspects. We've got pluralities of knowledge. We have our scientific knowledge, and within that there's a plurality. We have social science, natural science, different fields. We also have humanities and arts and culture. We have languages. We have indigenous ways of knowing, different worldviews, different understandings of reality. We have local knowledge. Locals are experts as much as a professor is an expert in the topics and questions that they have and are facing. We have bureaucratic knowledge, so those that work in government have expert knowledge on the rules and the procedures and the routines that are going to be relevant, that of course the scientist doesn't have access to. So there's so many different types of knowledge that have to be braided and intertwined, and that can only be done throughout the process of producing and undertaking the science. So I like to think about how do we even identify what the research question is, how do we identify what the method is, how do we identify whether the results are valid, whether they're useful, how do we measure success, how do we measure impact. These are really important questions for us because we're spending a lot of time and energy and money, and our students are learning and engaging, and we're learning and engaging as we go. But unfortunately, if you look at the systemic change that's occurring and the significant impacts that are occurring both as a result of the science that we've done, so we also know that sometimes we're creating problems. We didn't mean it. They're unintended consequences. They could be, these are often as a result of sort of siloed thinking or partial views, and so we need to get out of a situation where we're kind of chasing our tail as well. When we talk about transitions and sustainability, we have to recognize that these are an innovation as well. These are kind of contested spaces. What does a sustainable food system look like? What's our future look like? This is not a technical question, actually. There's a lot of different views about what we think the future should look like, and I think that the more we sort of bring a little bit of the politics into the discussion, a little bit of the debate that's going on, like we heard the Vox people talking about what they think the issues are, there's many different views beyond that. So I think that's the area that I think all of us have a really important role to play and we should be reflective of.
Absolutely. So thank you. I see in the Zoom panel that Dr. El-Wafi has raised her hand, and if I could just say, Dr. El-Wafi, how do we? I'm sure you have a comment on what Dr. Hickey just mentioned, but also I want to direct your focus perhaps onto how does the FAO respond to, for example, the current crisis in Ukraine having rippling effects, especially in the Middle East with the wheat supply. Just take us through like a day-to-day of how the FAO might respond to something like that.
Yeah, absolutely, Mehran. I could address that question, but if I may, I want to just comment what Gordon said about really sustainability and the need for us to agree on a definition. But I think if we look at now versus just 20 years ago, we used to really put agriculture in a silo. We didn't really look at the whole system. We tend really to look only at the production system, for example, and not so much agri-industry and processing, nor the logistic around it. So I think really what's happened last year with the UN summit, that we all agreed at least that we need to look at the agri-food systems. And for us, we don't say in FAO only food system, because we want to bring in also crop like cotton. We don't eat cotton, but cotton is very important agri-food system. So the agri combine everything that is food, feed, and fiber, all the three. So, and I think I agree with Gordon, that it's not the lack of science, it's not the lack of investment. It's mostly coordination and willingness to do it. And there is a huge problem with our economic system, the way that we are not factoring things properly, And one of the great papers that was developed last year was the true cost of food. So what we pay for food, it's not the real cost. There is a huge hidden cost behind environmental, taxes, you name it. So we need to really redo our math and rethink it, because we can't survive without food again. So we can survive without phones, not without food and air and water. So how do we react to crisis? See, FAO is an organization that really represents the country, the member states. We have 194 member states across the world. Most of the countries are part and parcel of FAO. So when we have crisis, it's very important to have information. It's very important, for example, when the war started, it's very important to know how much really the supply that used to come from Ukraine, particularly, and Russia, is not making it to the international market. And we have what we call AgMIP, and we have a system really to monitor both the quantity and the prices. So that information is very important for countries to know really if they need to divert their deals in terms of buying food or selling food, but also, or commodities, but also in terms maybe of intensifying the local production, or maybe converting the consumers to use other species. And that's really, it's because of most of the food is traded in the international market. So, and that's part of the problem. Part of the problem is that we are not, again, we have been looking at traceability for food safety issues, but we have never looked at traceability for efficiency of the trading system. So the WTO said that any product, any commodity, any product cross the border at least twice. So it's produced somewhere, it's transported thousands of miles away to be processed, and it's coming back and then going up. So there is a huge, we are not using the traceability and the data to understand efficiency, and we need better efficiency, particularly given the environmental footprint. The most of the environmental footprint of the agriculture environment, it comes from transportation. So we need to rationalize the way we are doing it. So FAO has four major roles as a whole. One of them is policy advice, and we provide policy advice at the global level, at the regional level, and the national level. Second one, it's technical advice, and we help countries. We have what we call TCP, which is technical country programs, whereby we are helping many countries to either redesign their agri-food system or to develop new areas and new agri-food systems. We have capacity building. So you might have heard of Farmer School, which is one of the innovation of FAO, which is a peer-to-peer learning, getting farmers to really learn from each other and have leaders within the farming communities. And we have our fourth role, it's knowledge management. So knowledge management is bringing all the knowledge together. So I always say the role of FAO is to a little bit level the playing field. Countries in OECD, the OECD member countries, have all the capacity to do their own analysis, to see how they transform for climate change, how they transform to have better access to international market. But most of, or how to use new technologies like gene editing to speed up their breeding programs. Countries in the South, they don't have that capacity. So FAO is here to bring the knowledge and provide it to all at the same level, so that we are a little bit leveling the playing field and making sure that the developing world have access to knowledge, has access to analysis, and has access to capacity building to hopefully really put it as part and parcel of their national system and increase both their productivity as well as make the agri-food system really better fit for their ecosystem and their culture and their countries. So that's the role that we play. We have an emergency program, which is small in the grand scheme of things, because WFP does most of the emergency programs. And within that, we work very closely with WFP to really make interventions and have emergency program and humanitarian programs in Ukraine, as we are doing it in other countries such as Syria, Yemen, Afghanistan, and so on and so forth. So with WFP, we try really to bring in the humanitarian development nexus and to strengthen it, because it's very important post any war or during any war that you do short term, which is purely humanitarian, but also you put in place a system to move to the development, because if you don't do that, you are really doomed, and mostly the people that are affected by the war directly have no plan forward. So the humanitarian development nexus, it's very important, and we're working very closely with WFP to make sure that continuum between saving lives and providing food when it's needed, with really having a plan in place for people to go back to produce their own food and be independent from humanitarian work or humanitarian help.
Perfect.
Over to you, Mehran.
Yeah. Thank you, Dr. Al-Wafi. It's really fascinating for me to hear about this, and I'm sure for some of the students here that I generally get the feedback from students about how they want to be affecting this kind of change, and it's great to hear what the FAO is doing. I'm mindful that we're a couple minutes over time, but I just wanted a couple of quick fire responses from our panel here. Dr. Hoyos Villegas, we hear a lot about how the government wants to reduce emissions from fertilizer use in agriculture. What's one way in which your research could help bring that about?
Right, that's a very good question. So one of the things, we tackle that from a couple of perspectives, right? One of them is just by the sole nature of introducing pulses, which are legumes that fix their own nitrogen, that has in itself without any, any major introductions of new and improved agroecosystem services from the varieties themselves, just the use of these in farming systems are a major way of reducing and diversifying the farm energy use, right? But in my lab in particular, we focus on understanding and utilizing the amount of genetic variation that exists in both the wild and the domesticated gene pools of the crops that we breed, to maximize the ability of these legumes to associate with nitrogen-fixing bacteria in the soil. And so in future cycles and generations of the materials that we generate, we expect that with the technologies we're developing to enhance the throughput of detection and measuring of this symbiosis, we hope that we can create better root system, healthier root systems, and more nitrogen that can be fixed per unit area. Yeah. Right? This is a long-term effort, and it requires that many other pieces come together in order to ramp up this technology because of the complexity of the association. Absolutely. That's one way. Yeah.
So I don't know if you folks have ever looked at freight trains going by. You'll see that a lot of those carriages are carrying liquefied anhydrous ammonia, and that's the the stuff of fertilizer. So maybe less of that and more legumes fixing nitrogen through their partnership with bacteria. So I'm getting signals that we need to end here, but maybe a quick word from Dr. Hickey about how which partners that you talk to implement change.
I think the most important thing is identifying interdependencies. If you have an objective that you're trying to achieve, it's going to depend on the success of interventions in other parts of the system. And the kind of work we do is trying to help researchers or governments or communities, civil society organizations, identify those interdependencies through complex systems approaches so that they know who they have to work with and how to coordinate their efforts to the kind of shared goals that they have.
Perfect. Thank you so much. Thank you.
Before we move to the second roundtable, we'll watch a little vox pop that was shot here at McDonald campus, asking students questions about the future of agriculture, the future of crops, and the challenges of agriculture. Let's listen.
To feed the world, we will need all the inputs from all the nutrients. So I guess the proteins, the carbohydrates, and vitamins, minerals in those proportions. I'm sure there is no crop that has everything in the right proportion, but the ones that have a higher quantity can be, especially for kids, protein in high quantity with carbohydrates. I think legumes and cereals will be most welcome.
One is very productive, so it needs less field that can generate more, so we can feed more people.
Not all land can grow every single crop. Corn is very versatile. You can basically grow it anywhere, except up north. You know, it's harder because of the climate and everything. You can do silage corn for animals, but grain corn or sweet corn is harder. So versatility and volume and low input are three factors that are important to consider into choosing a crop that's going to feed the world.
Je pense qu'il faudrait avoir des types de plantes ou peu importe ce qu'on peut planter qui prennent moins d'espace mais qui produisent mieux. Ensuite, qui prennent moins des ressources, qui ont besoin de moins de pesticides pour les faire pousser comme il faut.
Grown in a lab.
Oh yeah. For example, some meat can be artificial protein based. You use the bacteria to generate cellulose or something, and then to make the fake meat. I think if this is acceptable by most of people, then we can do that for all the other types of the food, because bacteria is easy to culture.
More regenerative agriculture as well, or vertical farming, and not the way that we currently see it necessarily with the typical tractor on a field. And more automation, I think, yeah, and have it be that one person can watch more happening in front of them rather than being in control of one field at a time, being in control of multiple fields at a time.
I see agriculture feeding the world. That is the future of agriculture, and it will take a concerted effort from all the fields of agriculture to make sure that food is available on the table for 8 to 10 billion populace. And with the future of agriculture, artificial intelligence will take the main stage. The AI of this world is making the food available with limited drudgery, limited number of use of hands in achieving food security and food nutrition. So production will increase when technologies are leveraged on to make sure that we have food sufficiency. Now the challenge is having the full knowledge so that we can take advantage of this latest technology.
Yeah, too much waste probably. It's could be more efficient.
Yeah, especially for some developing country, they still suffer from the hunger. Yeah, so we need to generate more and safe and nutrient-rich food for them.
Meat will probably decrease and be replaced by other forms of either plant-based or cellular agriculture.
Il y a les ressources, il y a toute l'eau et tout, les pesticides. Malheureusement, je pense que ça, c'est un des gros problèmes qu'il faut essayer de tackle présentement. Mais honnêtement, je sais pas. Je pourrais pas dire les principaux puis les plus importants, mais ouais, essayer de rendre ça plus écologique, là.
now to our second roundtable entitled Transformational Development, Meeting Global Challenges. I'd like to invite the moderator, Dr. Sala Karboun, whom you've already met, to the stage, and she will be joined by three speakers, Professor Daiva Nielsen. Daiva Nielsen, please join us. She's an assistant professor in the School of Human Nutrition and a William Dawson Scholar at McGill University. She's also the scientific director of the Clinical Nutrition Research Unit. Welcome. And she'll be joined with Professor Michael Ngadi. Welcome. Dr. Ngadi is a James McGill professor at McGill University. He's been teaching and directing multidisciplinary international projects related to food processing technologies, quality and safety optimization, and nutrition-sensitive value chains. Dr. Ngadi has led large-scale international projects that have impacted millions of people in Asian, Caribbean, South American, and African countries. Welcome, Dr. Ngadi. And last but not least, Pascal Thériault. Pascal Thériault is the director of the Farm Management and Technology Program here at McGill. His areas of specialty include farm business management, agri-food marketing, policy analysis, and management of human resources. Voilà, la parole est à vous. The floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Catherine. It's really a pleasure for me to take and animate this roundtable. I did enjoy the first one. We see different perspectives. And now we are going to move on. You know, when we talk about environment, agriculture continuum is quite large. We need to consider, we heard from the chief scientist, the agriculture system has been to consider in its global. So for this roundtable, we would like to focus more on discussing how can we bring the nutritional sustainability? I will have to say I'm very supportive of what we call a nutritional sustainability. Like when we talk about food security, yes, we need to feed people, but we need also to make sure that we are achieving the nutritional sustainability by providing them the diversity of the nutrients and by ensuring that these nutrients are being preserved and are also being given us an opportunity to improve their well-being, the health of all the consumers and all populations. So I'm going to start with my colleague, Dr. Daiva Nielsen, and I know that you have been very active in looking to the nutrition, behavior, and health outcomes. And my question is when we want to achieve, when we're looking to solutions to achieve a sustainable, nutrition-sensitive food system. And we know that food system is complex. It has been touched to some extent that we have different levels. We're talking about individual levels, where people with their habits, with their awareness. We're talking about organizational levels, where we need to adopt technology, which is still a challenge up today. We have technology, we have science, but we need to adapt them. And we have also the system, which is much more larger, looking to the economy, policy, and so on. So in your opinion, at the current strength of the evidence, how can be the contribution, or how can we really try to endeavor our efforts at different level? And more importantly, we need synergy between this level to ensure impact. So I want to hear your opinion on how can we get involved in all this level and take advantage of this synergy.
Very nice questions. Thank you, Dr. Karboun. And I just want to mention the students' comments in that last clip were excellent. I was so impressed with their remarks. I think when we think about sustainability from a nutritional perspective, we have to think about the context and the need of the area that we're targeting. So I want to start off by thinking of the more impoverished parts of the world and how we can develop nutritional solutions with our scientific activities and advancements in our technologies. So we have so many opportunities now with biotechnology and our understanding of how we can modify food production to meet nutrition needs and address those problems. And there's a lot of micronutrient deficiencies in low and middle income countries, particularly in Southeast Asia and parts of Africa, where genetic engineering or other types of biotechnology can be really very, very significant solutions. But unfortunately, while the science is there and we understand how to use genetic engineering quite effectively to create solutions, a very good example is golden rice. If anyone is familiar with that, it is a genetically engineered cultivar of rice that produces beta carotene. That is a precursor to vitamin A. And in parts of the world, there are substantial rates of vitamin A deficiency, which, especially amongst children, can cause a lot of morbidity and lead to early mortality. So vitamin A deficiency increases risk of infectious disease susceptibility and also blindness early on in life. So it can lead to premature death with those complications. But golden rice can produce beta carotene and improve the vitamin A status in certain parts of the world. But it's been very difficult to get it to the market because of the complexities around acceptance and mistrust in science, and that's a significant barrier. So while scientifically the understanding is there, the technology is there, getting it to the people is very complex. And so we've seen that reflected in other areas scientifically through the COVID pandemic, this issue of not having the sufficient trust in science and to be able to implement things that we've learned and that we can demonstrate are safe and effective. So that's a challenge in certain parts of the world, but it can be more broadly generalized to the global population of how do you work together with science and the institutions and the governance and ultimately the consumers to be able to implement our strategies in the most effective way and have the best outcomes. So I hope that some of the strategies we're coming up with consumer messaging and education will be effective to helping create the pipeline for bringing those technologies to the marketplace. And if we think about a rich country like Canada and other North American countries and in countries in Europe, when we think about the retailing messages, those can be quite influential. So sort of nudging consumers to making better choices, opting for products that might have better health impacts for them and also better impacts on the environment. I think we can harness some of the messaging in the retail sector and thinking about food labels and how to help guide consumers to making some better choices. But it is complex and it will require synergies between the scientists, the government and public health officials, and ultimately consumers and those who work in the retail sector to really bring more convergence and come up with solutions that will be very effective.
Okay, thank you very much, Dr. Nielsen. I will move on now to more focus a little bit on applied parts of nutrition-sensitive food system. And my question to Professor Michael Ngadi, I know you have directed many multidisciplinary research projects internationally, and it has been mentioned by Katrine, and everywhere in Asia, Caribbean, South of America, Africa, and so on. And some of your projects, we have seen some real impact there. So my question to you is, through the work that you have done, and I think I wanted to present your project about nutrition-sensitive food system, if you can tell us a little bit about this project, and also tell us when you try to address the nutrition sensitivity and sustainability issues across the entire food production value chain, what are the challenges that you have been faced with it, and in your opinion, how can we envision how sustainable nutrition-sensitive food system can be built, and what are the innovations that we need to achieve that?
Thank you. Very good question. I'm going to step back a little bit and rock the boat somewhat. I've heard this morning talking about that it is not about science, and I think I understand where that comment is coming from, because yes, the science is there. We've made tremendous progress in science, and that's a fact. But because the food system is complex, and with so many players and so many components and stakeholders. But if you step back and think about our world food system right now, our world food supply, most of the food that is largely consumed worldwide is pretty much three, basically. You are really talking about wheat, corn, rice. And that is totally unacceptable. And it is very difficult for us to talk about nutrition-sensitive agriculture when we do not talk about that. I have had several occasions personally when I've gone out to some developing countries, African countries, and talk about neglected foods. And Dr. Wafi talked about that, which I think is fantastic. And you find most international organizations are not really as interested in talking about that. And I'm glad that there is someone, the chief scientist, that has already mentioned that. I hope that will be the direction that the worldwide would go globally. So if you talk about rice, for instance, West Africa imports, it used to be, I think the number has gone down, about 70% of the rice that they consume. And then, of course, corn as well is totally imported, not to talk about wheat. West Africa would import most of the wheat that they consume. And there is no way you can talk about nutrition sensitivity with that scenario. So there is a problem there. There are good innovations that have been done. For instance, this is... I hope... So there are some grains, traditional grains, that have shown progress that we should be talking about. Now, in the terms of innovation, even rice, there are certain very basic traditional processing techniques that can be used to significantly increase the nutrition value of rice per boiling, for example, which I personally spent more than 15 years working in the West African sub-Saharan region. So we know that parboiled rice would increase in iron and calcium, for instance. But there are other very nutritious products, beans, for instance, in the West African region. If you were cooking beans, it would take hours. Sometimes they would have to soak it overnight. And in the local villages, in the local communities, they are no longer interested in those because, of course, it takes time, it is not convenient. And that goes, in Ethiopia, there are some that they would have to bury some products for 6 months before it is consumed. And that definitely is not sustainable. So we have to think about these things. And the bad news is we don't have the science that we have to look at this. So there is the need to support science, to support technologies, to make these neglected, the so-called neglected products, our food crop, bring them more into the mainline food availability. So that is something that we need to discuss if we want to talk about nutrition, if we want to talk about the sustainability of the food system. But I think the question is what innovations that we have to. And I think, again, that has come up, that we need to look at the food system approach. We have to look at the interrelationships and dependencies, which has come up, approach where we, right from the beginning, from production, processing, distribution, and consumption of food, we need to see how nutrition plays and how we can conserve the nutritive values of the food product. If you, again, I use example, if you process beans, we know that in some cases, about 90% of the micronutrients are lost during processing. So if you look at the literature now, they will say, well, this legume is high in micronutrients, but then the consumer do not see that. So we've done work, fortunately, in Malawi and Zambia, where we work with local women to simply say, well, instead of soaking overnight, you can probably soak for 2-3 hours, and then change the way you process that. Very simple technology. It doesn't have to be rocket science, but that can make a huge difference in the availability of micronutrients. And then, of course, a technology that we introduced in Malawi again and Zambia about fish powder. So in these regions, they would consume a whole lot of small fish right from the lake, and just teaching the women about using fish powder, incorporating fish powder into their daily other staples would significantly increase the quality of their food product. But I think the other thing that we need to think about, we need to worry about, is how do we actually measure success? What does success look like? What does a good, sustainable, nutrition-sensitive agriculture look like? So that would mean we would have to have a ways of measuring the impact of nutrition-sensitive interventions. And that's something that I have been very fortunate to work on, and you asked me to talk a little bit about that. So what that happens right now, the way that we measure nutrition status of people, of community, would be to go out and evaluate this. That takes resources, that takes time, that takes all kinds of things. And is there any way that we can come up with a very agile and easy, friendly technologies that we can measure those platforms? And of course, today, with technology and artificial intelligence, we are able to track what communities eat, what people eat. And they can give the information online, well, with a cell phone. And if there is no internet or if there is no phone connections, there are tools that can be used to have this data streamed to policymakers or project directors in order that we can make evidence-based decisions about what people eat and what people should not eat. And we have seen that this has worked very well in different countries that we have been able to try this. And then also coming up with indicators. How do we measure these interventions? How do we measure success? And that's something that in my lab and in my group that we have been concentrating on, and we want to be able to have this used widely, and we want to be able to modify this as we go to be sure that we can have a good handle on nutrition-sensitive interventions, making sure that the interventions will eventually lead to a good and high-quality diet for communities.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Professor Ngadi. Very, very good insight. I mean, the adaptation to the local or to the global need is very important, because at the end we need to adapt to the reality and also to measure it, to be able to follow it. That's the way how we can learn and how we can keep going and progress in our endeavors. It's a pleasure to have also with us my colleague Pascal Thirault, qui est le vice-président de l'Ordre des agronomes et le directeur de notre programme de farm management here at McGill. Tu es un économiste, donc ma question va être surtout sur l'économie. So we're discussing the nutrition-sensitive foods, and we know the nutrition-sensitive food, there is a global need, but there is also a local and regional need as well. We know how the government here in Quebec, they are promoting good health through good health and good well-being of the population through the food system as well. So how affordable are they, and what action do we really need to do globally in Canada to make them affordable, right? Because the economic aspect we don't want, it's an important aspect if we want to make impact to consider. So I want just to hear from you, how do you see the economic aspects when we talk about the nutrition-sensitive food system?
That's a really good question. Actually, I think over time, we our food system evolved, where we went from a system where we were just strictly dealing with comparative advantage, so strictly in financial terms, where it would be cheaper to produce food somewhere else and just import it than actually produce it here. That generated some very capital-intensive processors that were extremely efficient, but that system only works as long as it works. And unfortunately, we lived in the last few years disruptions in that logistic chains, where it was harder to get products across, it was harder to get products processed, and those economies can only keep existing as long as those capital-intensive investments can be used their full capacity, which we were unable to do. So maybe that allowed us to realize that the way we were doing things, as Dr. El-Wafi pointed out, made us realize that we were not paying the true cost for food. So moving forward, how can we better work on it? And we have to keep in mind, if we look at an economic standpoint, where we consider all the cost externalities or not, that the way we developed our food system, crossing borders once or twice with basic commodities and then processed food, did involve producing packaging, did involve moving the food around. And so ultimately, we were consuming oil to move water. Well, not just water, nutritious food also, but mainly water, weight-wise. And as we look at more sustainable food systems, I think being able to process locally, to be able to consume locally, is when we will be able to do it. And my colleague, Professor Hickey, had that comment about change, and I had it pinned on my door for the longest time because I thought it was funny. Food is complicated because as much as we work with food, as much as we produce food, we also consume that food. So it's not a purely rational decision. Buying a hammer is something that's extremely rational because there's very little emotional sensitivities that go with buying a hammer or a screwdriver. For a majority of the people on this planet, buying food is not strictly about survival. There is pleasure that comes with it. So we have some non-financial values that are associated with food, and if we're going to work at change, I think we're going to have to better educate everyone along the chain to work in that direction, on not necessarily financial terms, but also on those values that we were brought up with. And quite often when you look at sensitive products, we consume some of the products we consume because our parents were consuming them, our grandparents were consuming them. So expecting change in food in the very short term is extremely hard. And I remember attending a conference a few years back when one person in product development said, as we move toward healthier food, as we try to cut our sodium intake, for example, one of the biggest mistakes you can do is just cut sodium, because all of a sudden consumers won't recognize the product and they'll switch to something else. So from a corporate standpoint, it does not make sense, even though from a health perspective, it does. So how do you work to try to get the consumer to adopt new practices is something I think we have to work on collectively.
Thank you very much. And I agree with you, food is complicated, but also it does bring joy and it's emotional, and we have to make a decision each day about food. I would like for the next round to look a little bit to the future, okay? We try to see perspectives. We like to guide the future. We like to come up with transformative way of doing it. And of course, the only way how to do it is to understand what is happening today and to see if we can predict and if we can guide our food systems, if we can have an impactful research and impactful actions. That's how we nurture us as a faculty. So, Deva, what do you oversee as a research effort that is needed to be able to converge, I use the term converge, to integrate the sustainable food system with the nutritional sustainability? How can what should be done today in terms of science to do that, to achieve that?
It's a very good question. I think there's a lot of opportunity to look at the messaging that we direct to the consumer. And again, I'm thinking about more the high-income context here. But it's really interesting with food labeling. There's been a lot of work done into claims and health claims and nutrient claims. If you've picked up a product and it says low in saturated fat, and that consuming foods low in saturated fat may reduce your risk of heart disease. So there's been a lot of scientific effort in developing those types of phrases that we now see on food packages. And maybe we can do the same kind of thing for sustainability, the kinds of foods that would be useful to promote in the food supply for consumption that will at the same time have a benefit for sustainability and a lower environmental impact. So using the techniques and methodologies we've crafted for looking at health and nutrition claims and applying that, I think, to sustainability is one area that we can try to harness a bit more.
That's a very, very good point. This is a way of stimulating. I know that we have some of industrial partner here with us today, is to simulate sustainability as being part of the identity of the food. But we need engineering, like my colleague, Dr. Professor Ngadi, to be able to achieve that. So what do you oversee as innovation or as a way of how can we change the way how we're developing a nutrition-sensitive food in terms of, from a technology perspective, that will help us to achieve this integration, but also it has to be successful from different perspectives. Accepted by the consumer, being also successful economically, and also to be able to generate some revenue that we can keep building on it.
Thank you. I think the food production system of the future is more likely going to be smaller scale, diverse, and that is going to bring a lot of new challenges that we do not have. In fact, it looks like we're going to go through a cycle. When we started production, food revolution, so many years ago, it used to be smaller farms, and then we grew, and then we have larger farms, larger production systems. But then in the developing countries, it's mostly small scale. And we have come to a point where we don't understand it very well at this moment. So we're going to go back and understand how do we develop technologies and how do we develop processing strategies that will handle smaller scale production, particularly for these so-called neglected food crops, which we do not know right now how to do that. So there needs to be more support for science, support for knowledge, particularly for these high nutritive food crops that we are not as familiar. One good example is what has happened in quinoa, right? In Bolivia, quinoa used to be for the poor, but we now know that this has changed significantly. Now, but in order to do that, we need to develop new processing systems that will handle these lesser known crops. And I think there is need for support, there is need for development in that area. And African yam bean, for instance, or some other legumes in the sub-Saharan region that we do not know exactly. So there is the need to develop new technologies for that, new science and technologies for that. Then on the other hand, we would need to be able to find a way to link up more tightly this whole aspect of production and nutrition. Right now is anecdotal, and we need to develop new techniques, new methods, decision analysis, decision.
When you're ready.
In order for us to understand the linkage between production, nutrition, and health, and the metrics and indicators that we would need to be able to understand evolution in this. And that is something that is very challenging. I know FAO has some indicators, nutrition sensitive indicators, the MDDW, for instance, that FAO is pushing, but there are other indicators that we would have to be able to find out how do we measure diet quality, diet diversity, and how do we develop these metrics that will be used for pathways, intervention pathways that will eventually achieve nutrition security. or better nutrition status of individuals. And to do this at scale. It's important to do that, and I think we will need to develop new technologies to do that. And there are some technologies that we can, processing technologies, appropriate level processing technologies that we can use to do that. And that is not going to happen with some of the technologies that we already know right now. We would have to, in some cases, come up with new and different approach and strategies to do that. That's where research, that's where science, and that's where support comes in. And not to forget the marginalized people, communities, because right now some of the food that they consume would not be among the big three that we talk about.
Okay, thank you. Very interesting. So the adaptability is an important aspect, to be able to come up with the technology adapted to the end users and to involve them. And that's what's really important. It's not to come with a scientific question, as Gordon mentioned, but to involve them from the beginning. Involve them from the beginning when we want to come up with the technology, but the assessment tools play an important role. That's how we can learn from what we are doing. So, Monsieur Pascal Thirault, nutrient diversity, nutrient density, it's important. There is a flow, but we know that there is a big divide between the producers and the consumers. So we know education is important. There is no doubt on that. But how can we close this gap? How practically can we, because if we're able to close this gap, my opinion, we can make more impact.
Well, you did steal part of my answer, because I was going to say education, education, and education. Well, I think change has to come from within. Therefore, we can see in Canada that farmers are more and more trained. They have better schooling, and I think that generates a situation where they're more open to change. And we see the same thing with processors, and we must do the same thing with consumers. I think as consumers, we don't like to be told what to do, but ultimately, if it comes from us, it's going to be much easier to adopt new practices. And you see how agriculture changes, how we get new products out, how we dare try new things that only 1 or 2 generations ago was something that we did not think we could even consider for food. And you look at what's being done in agriculture. I often look at the developments in urban agriculture, for example. Some people might think that it will solve all of the world food problems. I don't. But I think urban agriculture is really important, because as our population is getting more and more urban, we lose that contact with what agriculture is, what food production is, and urban agriculture has a great role to play to bring that production aspect closer to the consumer, so that the consumer can actually understand what it involves to produce food, and ultimately to produce good food that can be produced locally, ideally produced locally, but at least that's being produced sustainably.
Thank you. So it has been really a pleasure to animate this roundtable. Thank you very much for your contribution. I will give now the floor to Catherine. Thank you.
For the final remarks, I'd like to introduce Professor Anya Geitman. She is the Dean of the Faculty of Agricultural and Environmental Science and Associate Vice Principal here at McDonald Campus. I had the great honor to meet Professor Geitman, Dr. Geitman, back in 2017. I interviewed her for my show, and I know it's a bit of a leap of faith when you give an interview, same with Dr. Carboun and Pascal Thirault also. It's a bit of a leap of faith because, yes, you do this on-cam interview and you don't know what we journalists are going to do with it afterwards. But in the end, I think she was quite happy with the result. And she actually took the report with her to Ottawa, to a senatorial committee where she showed it there. So the floor is yours, Dr. Geitman. Thank you.
Thank you, Catherine, for the kind remarks. And indeed, somehow you managed to put my words in that interview into the right order to make sense for the audience. So it's always impressive. Now, I don't have that privilege right now. I'll have to try to make sense of what I heard today for you. And Clearly, food security under climate change is a huge challenge. And in order for me to wrap my head around this, and in order to see what universities can contribute to this, I try to go about this with a few categories, right? What is the what, the how, the who does it, and why do we do it? And so I'm going to start with the what. Clearly, we need to look into the crops that we eat. Professor Gnadi has pointed out that we focus on very few crops, which is neither good for our own nutrition nor actually for biodiversity. There are a lot of crops that are underexploited yet. What kind of food do we put in our body in order to not only put in calories, but actually nutrition that is healthy for us? What kind of crops do we grow in order to be efficient, but also what kind of animals do we produce, and can we actually afford the amount of animals we're producing right now worldwide and consuming? That's the what. What about the how? How do we do agriculture in order to also combat climate change, for example, by building up topsoil? How can we avoid chemical inputs or environmental impact? What kind of technologies can we use? Do we have already, or do we need to develop in order to improve the environmental impact or reduce it? Where will we get our fertilizer in the future, when ships of fertilizer deliveries might get stuck in the middle of the ocean because of geopolitical challenge, or simply because we're running out of mineral fertilizer? We heard about nitrogen fixation, that some species do really well. Can we transfer those genes into other crop species? We all know now what mycorrhiza are. We can buy them in shops in order to use them in our backyard. 20 years ago, that didn't exist. So these things can exist, and research has allowed us to implement them. That's the how that we have to think about. What's the who? Of course, farmers, breeders, big ag, but also our own backyard. We talked about urban agriculture, and there is a role for urban agriculture. We'll never grow wheat through urban agriculture, but we might be able to grow certain produce and eat it with a zero distance in terms between the growth and our dinner table. But also thinking of other continents, certainly Africa. I just visited Ghana and Senegal. Empowering those who may be not involved yet in sufficient numbers, women, for example, certainly in Africa. How can we contribute to that? Empowering women entrepreneurs is one way to go about it. So the who is important, but then I think one of the most important is the why. Because we won't change our behavior if we don't understand why. We won't go to alternative protein sources if we don't understand why we should do so. For example, are we going to go to all these pulses in our nutrition? Are we maybe going to move to insect proteins instead of, beef? What about policy? In many European countries, GMOs are still banned, although they promise so many solutions, for example, to introduce nitrogen fixation into certain crops or to improve drought resistance in other crops. In order to understand the why, we have to actually produce the data to understand why a certain product might have a reduced carbon footprint, why a certain product might have a better life cycle profile. So we need data. We need to interpret them, and we need to connect these dots, and we need to communicate this to the consumer as well as to those who can implement them. So a lot of roles for university in all of these points, in the what, in the how, in the who, and in the why. And I'm really excited by this. In each challenge, we need to see an opportunity, and I think there are huge opportunities for universities to contribute to that. With that, I thank all of you for coming here in person, and I thank all of those online for dialing in today. I think this was a really exciting event, and I'm very proud and very privileged to say that this is one of the final events of the Bicentennial year that McGill has celebrated for the past months. McGill has turned 200 years old, and I think this faculty has a really, really important role to play within the university background, but also within for the society, not only here in Montreal or Canada, but worldwide. Thank you for being with us today.
Thank you, Dr. Geitman, and once again, thank you to all of you here in person and online as well. It's been a pleasure. It's been very inspirational. What an inspirational speech as well, and I hope we can all use this information to build a more sustainable future and food system. Thank you so much.